Hi, everybody, and welcome to your final social theory for the course. As you'll recall, we started out with presentism, and many of you had an okay time with presentism. It's not as hard to understand, and it makes sense when we're talking about history. Then we did structuration theory, and again, there were a lot of you who kind of got it, and a few of you who kind of didn't. I think this last social theory will be for everybody, and it is called, as you can see, social identity theory. So let's get started. Before we get right into social identity, let's talk a little bit about personal or individual identity. If somebody asks you, how do you define yourself as an individual? You may say something like, well, I'm a student, I'm a sister, I'm a member of this family, I have this job, and there are a lot of ways you could define yourself. This is going to be different from what your social identity is and how we define ourselves socially. Let's take a look at that now. So the interesting thing about our social identity is that many of us, if somebody asks us who we are, we might actually begin to tell them what our social identity is because it's so strong for some of us. For example, if you happen to be on the BSU basketball team or the football team or any other team on campus, for you right now or whenever your sport is taking place, that may be the most important factor in how you define yourself. So it's really an interesting thing, the difference between individual identity and social identity. But the main difference is that your social identity is always connected to some kind of a social group. So as you can see, there are students talking in a group, probably some kind of a group project. There is a guy, uh, I guess, seemingly in some kind of a chat group, so online groups as well, maybe a fandom, I'm not sure. There's the football players. Down in the right-hand corner, I'm over top of it, but you would see people at a musical event of some sort. I mean, certainly if you're a Taylor Swift fan, you're a Swiftie, right? That puts you into another group. And then you see the West Ada School Board over there. That's a different kind of a group, a group that makes decisions for a school system. So that's also interesting, not as entertaining. And then you have the marching band, of course, at Boise State University, the Blue Thunder Marching Band has very tight ties to one another. And I know because I've known students in the past who've been part of that, that it's just as culturally based as, say, the football team is. So these are all important things that people can be part of. And all of you, I'm sure, are part of different groups. Why do we even care about groups? I mean, they're groups, we hang out in groups, we do things, but what is significant or important about our membership in groups? Well, if you really stop to think about it, it becomes very clear very quickly. So you get together in a group, and even if it's just a group of friends, folks, think about why you're with these people. It's because you have something in common with them. You think the same way that they do. They help you define who you are. And they give you a sense of belonging to something. And if you look, just even if we just take a look at the football team at our university right now, I mean, we have Coach Danielson, and he has made it very clear that he has a very specific culture. And whenever you see any of the players speaking on TV, you will see that they all say pretty much the same thing about how that group operates outside of the field and on the field both. I mean, it's very specific and very obvious that they share the same values, they think the same way, they feel good about their group in general, and they have a reason to want to keep that group uh, at a certain level, right? So that's what they try to do every year. And as you'll see, the last point on here that I make is about increasing your image or your status. So if you look at that very last point on the right-hand side to increase our self-image, this is what the football team is doing all of the time. And this year they are near the top with that self-image because they won their last game of last year, brought home a conference trophy. Everything is cool. They've got Ashton Genty right now. So they're increasing their group status right now. it's easier to get people to want to come and play football at Boise State because of that. This is where you want to stay. This is the optimal place for any group to be, is where our Boise State football team is right now. So this is Henry Tajfel. He's an interesting character, and if he were alive today, he would have some really fun observations about our society, because this is what he was interested in, is how people perceive other people's groups, basically, in social settings. So he started to look at groups during his time, and he realized that, people start to identify themselves with groups, at a very young age, really, and that these groups help them feel like they somehow belong to something bigger and better. That makes sense. We all have that feeling when we join a group. And that there's a process of categorization when people within the group see themselves one way and start to see people outside of the groups in another way. This also should be familiar to most of you. And then through this categorization, we get this idea of us and them. So us in our group, we're one way, which of course is the better way, and then them over there, they're another way completely. They're not like us. And this is a comparison we make to differentiate ourselves from their group, because our group, we want our group to be better. And so that's a process that takes part. And Tajfel was like, when this happens, when one group compares itself to another group and the members want to maintain that status, how are they going to do that? What's it going to happen at that point? So he came up with social identity theory to help him understand what happens once groups are formed, compare themselves to each other, and then try to maintain their status or try to increase their status. Over on the left, you can read about what Tajfel was trying to understand, but let's go right to the center of the slide and look at how social identity theory can help historians understand history a little better. Obviously, there are a lot of ways we can do this, but the three most important are, first of all, that it can help us understand how group dynamics and conflict between groups have impacted history. That's one way. And it helps us understand and make sense of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, because we see where it comes from in the process of comparison between groups. Keep that in the back of your head. Stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination comes from the process of group comparison. That's important. It also helps us explain how social movements occur. And this is largely from the notion of intergroup conflict. And that is a very important phrase. And you'll see that I have blacked it out on the left-hand side because it is something you have to know. Now, intergroup conflict is conflict between two different groups. Many of you are going to get confused, and there are some people who aren't going to watch this video closely enough, and they're going to think that intergroup conflict is inside of a group between group members. It is not. That is called intra-group conflict. So please don't make that mistake. What you're doing for this particular social theory is looking at intergroup conflict. For Tajfel, the process of creating groups was pretty simple. It's just 3 steps. First, there's social categorization, moving on to social identification, and then that very important step of social comparison. So we're going to break this down and look at each one of these steps separately. Tajfel tells us that the first thing that we do as people and human beings is that we categorize ourselves and other people in order to understand them better. So you can see the photograph here on the right-hand side shows you different beads being categorized into different little holding areas based on what? Color. Now, if we had different shaped beads, we could actually categorize those beads based on shape. And if we had shapes and colors, we might do shapes and colors in different places. I mean, there are tons of ways to categorize people. So when we're talking about people, we may include gender, ethnicity, your physical ability, religion, education, profession, economic status, what sports you like to play. I mean, there's all kinds of ways, and you all know this when you're thinking about the groups that you're a member of in the back of your head. Ask yourself, how am I categorized into this group? What categorization makes me belong to this group? So then you become part of this group and you become an interchangeable member of this group. Not meaning that you lost your own sense of identity as a human being, but that when you're in the group, when you're taking part in the group, you have kind of put that aside for the moment. And the identity you have is the same identity as every other person in that group that you're in. This is what Tajfel tells us. Then he says that what happens during this part is that we start to realize that we are somehow different in this group. And this is when that first little step of us and them starts to occur. Once the idea takes hold that there is an us and them, and it starts pretty early in that categorization process, then we can move to the next part of this process at the end, and we can talk about the in group, which is the group that the person decides that they belong to, because they look at the group and they identify with the group values, group ideas, the stances of the group in general, and they look at other groups maybe that they know of, and those groups become the out groups because they don't join them, because they either don't believe in the same things that the other group believes in, they have negative feelings about the group, there's some reason why they don't belong that group, and it becomes the out group. So these are two important terms that you need to remember to be able to talk about social identity theory. That would be the in group and the out group. We've gone through the process of finding a group and looking at it and figuring out what its members think, what their goals are, what their values are. And we decide that that group looks a lot better than maybe 3 or 4 other groups. So the group we're looking at now becomes us. I'm going to join that group. And the other groups become them. The next part of my process of becoming a full-on member is social identification. So I'm going to start to lose little parts of my self-identity, my individual identity over time as I become more and more ensconced in this group membership. And it'll come to the point where I am more of the group than I am of myself when I'm with the group. And I start to behave by whatever norms I see this group follows. And I just start to distinguish those norms and behaviors from out groups. And this can eventually lead to social movements, as Tajfel likes to argue. We start to have really strong emotions and connections to this group as a member of the group. Again, you can use the football team, and you can see, if any of you are following the football team, how very tight that group of players is this year. They are all very much involved in being members of that team. And even Ashton Jeanty, who of course is a Heisman hopeful, he talks about the team more than he talks about himself in a lot of interviews. And so it's an interesting process. And Coach Danielson has nurtured that idea that we are one instead of we are a group of people. We are one. And that's very powerful. And it leads to self-esteem. When your status is good, as it is for the Boise State Broncos football team right now, your self-esteem as a member of that group is really high. Here is the third and final part of the Tajfel process of social identity theory, and that is social comparison, because this is where everything important happens between groups. We've categorized ourselves, we have identified ourselves. Now we're going, let's look around, are we the best group? Yes, we are the best group. Now we're going to look for reasons why we're the best group and start to compare those reasons to other groups. And our self-esteem, remember, in the identification process, our self-esteem starts to become tied to that group. So maintaining that self-esteem and our status as a group is going to cause us to look outside of our group. Sometimes groups form, in opposition to each other. And we have an example of that in just a minute. But other times these rivalries that develop are things that take a little bit of time to happen, and sports are a good place to see that again, where you have these rivalries and things happen quickly. But what we're going to do is compare ourselves, and it's going to be in such a way that we look better. We're the better group for some reason, and it may be based on our values. It may be based, if we're a sports team, on the fact that we win more. It could be based on a lot of different things, but we're going to find those things that make us look better, make us feel superior to the other groups that are somehow similar to our own categorization to make us feel better about the social comparison. Hopefully, most of you will understand this simple example from Harry Potter in the book or the movie. Social categorization takes place when the sorting hat is sorting the students into their different houses. And although usually the process of social categorization is done by the person themselves, they say, hey, this seems like a group for me. It's pretty basic at first. This is okay because it helps us understand how categorization happens. So sorting hat takes each person and puts them based on certain characteristics that they have. And we would do the same for ourselves. We would say, okay, that looks like a group that I might fit into. I'm going to give it a try. The social identification process happens when Harry gets into Gryffindor. That's where he's sorted into. He gets into Gryffindor and he starts to feel like he belongs to Gryffindor because a lot of the kids there have the same basic characteristics he does, the same values he does, the same motivations that he does, behaviors. He starts to identify with the group completely. The social comparison part comes when you hear them talking about the other houses. In particular, for Gryffindor, it's going to be the relationship between them and Slytherin. So Gryffindor is the good house and Slytherin is the bad house. And Ron makes the comment that there's not a witch or a wizard who went bad that wasn't in Slytherin, right? So there's a good comparison for you right there. He's stereotyping all the people from Slytherin saying that they're bad. Slytherin's just bad. So this is a simple example, but it shows the process at work. Using Tajfel's theory of social identity theory, we can start to look at how maybe historically we can peel apart the layers of the Harry Potter story and talk about intergroup conflict. So Slytherin and Gryffindor are every year engaged in the winning of the House Cup through Quidditch. It is a constant battle, and for them, a lot of self-esteem is wrapped up in this. If we win the Quidditch match and we win the House Cup, then we are the best group. We're the best house. The animosity between these two groups causes both of them to look for ways all year long at school to undermine the other house and how they look to the rest of the school. And that's a constant battle. And that is the battle for self-esteem, for superiority. In the Deathly Hallows, Part 2, a Slytherin girl makes an attempt to get Harry Potter to Snape at the time, who, of course, everybody thinks is a bad guy at that moment. And if she had succeeded in getting everybody interested in giving Harry Potter over to Snape, she may have created a social movement to supplant the power and the status of Gryffindor and to put Slytherin up in that status. I mean, that might have happened. It didn't happen, but it could have happened had she won that battle, had people come to her or come to her aid and said, yes, let's all get Harry Potter and give him to Snape. I mean, we could have seen a completely different story at the end. Let's take a recent example. All of you are probably aware of the anti-vaxxers and how they feel about vaccinations. So if you're in this category, you put yourself in this category, you probably believe that vaccinations don't work. You also probably believe that they can cause all kinds of developmental issues as well as death, and you feel that they restrict the personal freedoms of American citizens. So that is how you would categorize yourself as an anti-vaxxer. There may be other ways you would do that, but these are some of the most obvious ones. In the social identification process, of course, you would start thinking to yourself, well, I'm in this group of anti-vaxxers and they share the same beliefs that I do. I don't think vaccines work. I'm more interested in my personal freedom. And I'm also not so sure the government is being on the up and up with us. So if you're an anti-vaxxer, you start to look around at the other group. And let's be honest, there's just one other group to talk about, and that would be the pro-vaxxers. So the anti-vaxxers see themselves as patriotic people because they're talking about personal freedom, and that should be important to an American right. And also, they're talking about their distrust of authority figures, including scientists and politicians. And they look at pro-vaxxers and they say, listen, these people are being duped. They think they know everything, but they don't know anything. We know that there's all this stuff going on that the government doesn't tell us about. And that's what we're worried about. And we're not going to just simply roll over and take a vaccine. So this is how this entire argument begins. And you have the one group trying to do one up on the other group. Well, this is a really interesting case to take, actually, because if we go to that point where we want to talk about intergroup conflict, and there's been a lot of intergroup conflict between the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaxxers, has anybody ever had the upper hand? I mean, if you're in one or the other groups, you think that you have. The anti-vaxxers think that they have the upper hand, but the pro-vaxxers think they have the upper hand. Who has the upper hand? Who has the status? Who has the most self-esteem? Both groups think they're right. I mean, this is a very interesting case, and I'm not sure what Tajfel would say about it. Would he say that one group has made the move better than the other group? And in the intergroup conflict, has there been a social movement created? Yes, definitely a social movement. And what has it done for history? I'm not sure we can see the end of that yet. I mean, we can put it through the steps of social identity theory, but we can't really come to a conclusion yet because we're not looking back on history. So this is just an example of how we can put an event through the process, but we're going to have to wait probably 30 years, 40 years, maybe even 50 before we can look back on this period of time and decide what the heck did all of this mean? Did anybody come out on top of this? Because right now it's still very real, still a real argument, still going on. So there's another example for you. And that's about the end of this. One more slide and we'll make it good. One of the things in the structuration assignments that I noticed is that many of you weren't using the terminology to actually apply the theory. But when you apply theory, you always have to use the terminology. So I wanted to make some more comments here at the end to make sure that all of you get what that terminology is. And first of all, it is the process. You need to understand that there is a three-part process. Social categorization is the first one. Inside of social categorization is that idea of the us and them being created, which becomes the in group and the out group. Us is the in group, the out group is them. So all of that happens in social categorization. In social identification, which is part two of the process, the status begins. You start to see the self-esteem connected to the group and the group feeling the belongingness, each member belonging to the group. Then you get to part three, which is social comparison. This is where all the really interesting stuff for historical analysis happens. That would be discriminatory remarks against the other group, prejudice against the other group, and stereotyping of the out group, or what I've been calling the other group. So you need to have all of these ideas within your application of social identity theory. So when you write that essay for me, these things need to be in it. You can't just write me an essay about a group you're in. That's not going to work. Or give me an example of a group you're in. You have to be able to use this terminology to use the theory itself. All right, guys, this might be a little weird and wacky. Some of you are going to think, oh, this is really easy. I'm in this group. But please remember what I've just said about using the terminology. And let me know if you have questions.